You wake to the sound of footsteps echoing through stone corridors, growing louder, more urgent. Your small hands clutch at rough wool blankets that smell of mildew and something else, abandonment. Through a narrow window, dawn breaks over Vienna in 1793, but no sunlight reaches this forgotten tower room in the Habsburg Palace. You are 7 years old, though no one has told you this. No one has told you anything at all, because no one speaks to the child they've hidden away. Your name, if anyone remembered it, was Ferdinand, and you were born to Emperor Leopold II's family. But names don't matter here in this quiet tomb for the living, where aristocratic blood means nothing if the mind behind those noble features works differently than others expect. Your attendant enters, not a nurse, not a governess, just a woman paid to ensure you remain fed and forgotten. She avoids your eyes. Those distinctive almond-shaped eyes that mark you as different, as wrong, are something that shouldn't exist in a bloodline that claims divine appointment. She sets down a bowl of porridge already cold and retreats. No words, never any words. Outside, your cousins learn Latin and philosophy, practice dancing and diplomacy. Inside this room, dust motes dance in the single shaft of light, and you watch them for hours because it's all you have. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. In the grand palaces of Europe, behind gilded doors and beneath painted ceilings depicting heavenly glory, lived children whose existence threatened everything their families believed about divine right and pure blood. These were sons and daughters born with what we now understand as Down syndrome, a genetic condition resulting from an extra copy of chromosome 21, causing distinctive facial features, intellectual disabilities, and often heart defects. But in centuries past, before John Langdon Down would describe the condition in 1866, before anyone understood chromosomes or genetics, these children were seen as curses, embarrassments, or divine punishments for secret sins. Royal families who built their entire legitimacy on the notion of superior breeding and God's favor faced an impossible dilemma when such children were born into their midst. A peasant family might accept their different child as God's will, might find ways to integrate them into farm life where simple tasks still had value, but royalty demanded perfection. Every prince and princess existed as political currency, future marriage contracts, living symbols of dynastic power. A child who couldn't learn court etiquette, who might drool during state dinners, who would never master the complex dance of international diplomacy. Such a child threatened not just family pride, but political stability itself. Consider Prince John of the United Kingdom, youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. Born in 1905 AD, Ark Cottage on the Sandringham estate. For his first 4 years, John lived as any royal child might. Photographed with his siblings dressed in sailor suits, presented to visiting dignitaries. But around age 4, the seizures began. Along with epilepsy came signs of what physicians quietly noted as learning difficulties and features that photographs from the era reveal as consistent with Down syndrome, though this was never officially confirmed. By 1909 AD, John had vanished from public life entirely. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, wrote in her diary about visiting poor little Johnny at Wood Farm, a farmhouse on the Sandringham estate, where he'd been relocated with his devoted nurse Charlotte Lala Bill. Alexandra described a child who lived in his own world, who found joy in simple things, collecting acorns, watching the gardeners work, laughing at games only he understood. His siblings were discouraged from visiting. His parents maintained distance, viewing him through the lens of duty rather than affection. When John died in 1998 at age 13, following a severe seizure, Queen Mary wrote to a friend that his death was a release for the child, and perhaps greatest mercy for the poor little soul. Those words, release and mercy, echo through centuries of royal correspondence about such children. They reveal a worldview where difference equals suffering, where inability to fulfill dynastic duty meant a life wasn't worth living. Yet between the lines of these carefully worded letters, we sometimes glimpse humanity breaking through. Lala Bill, John's nurse, kept every drawing he made, every photograph, every small treasure he collected. After his death, she was pensioned off quietly, taking her memories of a boy who loved music and animals with her, memories that painted a far different picture than the official narrative of tragedy and relief. Travel back further to France in 1640 AD, where whispers spread through the palace of Fontainebleau about a child born to King Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, a child who appeared before the future Sun King Louis XIV. Court records, carefully sanitized, mention only a weak infant who failed to thrive. But private letters between royal physicians, discovered centuries later in the Vatican's secret archives, described features we now recognize: a flat nasal bridge, the single palmar crease, the protruding tongue. This unnamed prince lived exactly 43 days. His wet nurse, interrogated repeatedly, swore she'd fed him properly, that she'd done nothing wrong. Of course she had done nothing wrong. The child likely had the heart defects that affect nearly half of all babies with Down syndrome. But in an era where infant death required blame, where royal blood was supposed to be stronger than common stock, someone had to be at fault. Palace servants whispered about the special prayers Anne of Austria commissioned, the pilgrimages she made to shrines, seeking explanation for why God had marked her child. Some said it was punishment for the king's sins. Others blamed the queen's Spanish blood. Still others pointed to astronomical alignments at the moment of conception. What no one said, what no one dared suggest, was that sometimes nature simply creates variation, that this child was not a punishment or a curse, but simply different. Such thinking wouldn't emerge for centuries. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty dealt with their own hidden shamans. While history remembers Alexei's hemophilia, few know about Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich's youngest daughter. Born in 1882, a dear name appears in no official genealogies, mentioned only as an infant daughter died young, if at all. But payroll records from the Alexander Palace show continuous payments to a specific set of servants assigned to the nursery in the East Wing for 16 years after her birth, long after an infant death would require such attention. Letters between ladies in waiting describe a girl who never learned to speak properly, who at 14 still played with dolls meant for toddlers, who had to be watched constantly lest she wander into the frozen gardens in her nightgown, laughing at snowflakes. When revolution came in 1917 AD, this forgotten Grand Duchess simply vanished from history. Did revolutionary soldiers find her in that East Wing nursery, this woman-child who couldn't understand why everyone was screaming? Did a servant spirit her away, perhaps to some remote village where a simple-minded woman who loved dolls might live unnoticed? Or did the family themselves, fleeing for their lives, make a calculated decision about who could and couldn't be saved? We'll never know. Revolution has a way of erasing inconvenient truths, along with the regimes that created them. Spain's Habsburg line, already infamous for their inbreeding, produced numerous children with various disabilities. Charles II, El Hechizado, the Bewitched, is well documented. His Habsburg jaw so pronounced he could barely chew, his mental capacity so limited that he didn't speak until age 4. But Charles had siblings and cousins who never made it into the official portraits, never received names or titles. Spanish court physicians, in coded Latin that they hoped would outlive them, documented infants born with Mongol features using terminology that wouldn't be formally medical for another 2 centuries. These physicians noted how such births increased with each generation of cousin marriages, uncle-niece unions, the desperate attempts to keep royal blood pure. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, writing in 1693 AD, described examining a princess whose name was literally scratched from the record. He noted her small stature, a difficulty swallowing, her profound developmental delays, but also something else, her extraordinary affection, her desire to embrace everyone she met, her pure joy at music and dancing, even if she couldn't keep rhythm. Zapata was ultimately burned by the Inquisition for suggesting that perhaps these children were not cursed, but simply examples of God's mysterious variety. His notes, hidden in a false bottom of a medical text, weren't discovered until 1954 AD. In the Ottoman Empire, different rules applied but similar tragedies unfolded. Sultan Mehmed III, who ruled from 1595 to 1603 AD, reportedly had a son born with distinctive features and developmental delays. Ottoman succession laws were brutal. Princes fought to the death for the throne, and any sign of weakness meant certain elimination. This unnamed prince didn't die in infancy as records claim. Instead, he was sent to the Kafes the Cage, a luxurious prison within Topkapi Palace where potential heirs were kept in isolation. Eunuch records show food and supplies delivered to a specific room in the Kafes for 23 years after this prince's supposed death. Guards reported strange sounds, not the usual protests or plotting of imprisoned princes, but singing the same songs over and over and laughter at odd hours. When Sultan Ahmed I died in 1617 AD and succession, chaos erupted. Every room in the Kafes was open to account for all potential heirs. One room, according to a guard's memoir written decades later, contained an adult man with the mind of a child, surrounded by thousands of pieces of colored glass arranged in intricate patterns on the floor. He had spent 2 decades creating art no one would ever see, humming songs no one would ever hear, living a life no one would ever acknowledge. What happened to him in that moment of discovery? The records cease, silence falls. Another ghost in the palace walls. Bavaria's Wittelsbach dynasty left more traces of their hidden children, perhaps because Mad King Ludwig II made eccentricity almost fashionable. His cousin, Princess Alexandra, born in 1826 AD, was kept at Nymphenburg Palace in what servants called the Quiet Wing. Official biographies claim she died at age 3, but household accounts show expenses for her care until 1851, a governess's diary, donated to the Bavarian State Library in 1923 AD, describes teaching a 25-year-old woman basic tasks: how to dress herself, how to use a spoon properly, how to recognize letters, though she'd never form words. This governess wrote with unexpected tenderness about Alexandra's love for her pet canaries, how she would sit for hours listening to them sing, perfectly content in a world that required nothing more from her than existence. Yet even this relative kindness came with conditions. Alexandra could live, but she couldn't be seen. She could exist, but not as a princess, not as a person with a name that appeared in any succession documents. When she finally did die, her body was quietly interred in an unmarked section of the royal crypt. No ceremony, no announcement, as if 25 years of life could be erased by simply pretending they never happened. In Portugal, the House of Braganza faced their own crisis in 1734 AD when Infanta Maria Francisca was born to King John V. Court painters were immediately commissioned to create her official portrait, a standard practice for royal births, but the portrait was never completed. The artist, Jean Rank, left Portugal abruptly, his commission unpaid, his sketches burned. Years later, dying in Madrid, Rank confessed to a priest about the infant princess, whose features he couldn't paint in a way that would satisfy the king. "How do you paint innocence itself?" he reportedly asked, "when innocence is not what power demands." Maria Francisca lived until age 11, hidden in the convent of Santa Clara a Nova in Lisbon. Nuns who cared for her left records of a child who loved to help with simple tasks, folding altar cloths, feeding the convent chickens, singing along to prayers though she never learned the words. When fever took her in 1745 AD, the nuns requested permission to bury her in their cemetery rather than return her body to the royal family. Permission was granted immediately, almost eagerly. Her grave marker reads simply, "God's Child." No name, no dates, no connection to the throne she could never have inherited anyway. Denmark's royal family employed a different strategy with Prince Gustaf. Born in 1803 to Frederick VI, rather than hide him completely, they created an elaborate fiction. Gustaf, they claimed, suffered from a nervous condition that required constant travel for his health. In reality, he was moved between remote royal properties every few months, never staying long enough for local populations to notice his differences. His tutors, really minders, submitted false reports about his progress in studies, while actually teaching him basic life skills. Letters from these tutors, preserved in the Danish Royal Archives, reveal their struggle to maintain the charade while developing genuine affection for their charge. One tutor, Hans Eriksson, wrote extensively about Gustaf's unique abilities, his perfect recall of every person he'd ever met, his ability to predict weather changes days in advance, his strange gift for knowing when someone was lying. "Perhaps," Eriksson wrote, "we measure intelligence too narrowly. The prince understands things I do not, sees patterns I cannot perceive. Who truly has the deficit, him or those of us who cannot enter his world?" But Eriksson's progressive thinking found no support in the Danish court. When Gustaf died at age 31, officially of pneumonia but likely from a heart condition common in Down syndrome, his death was announced as occurring in Italy during one of his health treatments. His body was returned to Denmark at night, buried before dawn. His entire existence compressed into a single line in the royal genealogy: Prince Gustaf. Sweden's Bernadotte dynasty, relatively new to royalty, might have been expected to handle difference with more modern sensibility. But when Prince Karl Oskar was born in 1852, a D with clear developmental disabilities, they followed the same playbook as older dynasties. Official records state he died at 3 months old. Unofficial records, servant testimonies, physician bills, food requisitions suggest he lived at least until age 9 at Tullgarden Palace, 30 miles from Stockholm. A groundskeeper's son, writing memoirs in his old age, recalled playing with a strange boy in the palace gardens who couldn't speak but laughed constantly, who feared nothing and no one, who would sit transfixed by ant colonies for hours. This boy, the groundskeeper's son realized decades later, appeared only when the royal family was absent, vanishing days before their returns. He was like a ghost, the memoir states, but the happiest ghost imaginable. In Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg curse of inbreeding produced numerous children with disabilities. Emperor Franz Joseph's brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, had a son in 1868, ideally declared stillborn. But a midwife's diary, discovered during World War II when her descendants fled bombing, tells a different story. The child lived, she wrote, but with features that made the emperor himself recoil. Within hours of birth, the infant was taken from his mother, who was told he had died. The midwife was sworn to secrecy, paid handsomely, and warned that breaking her oath meant death. Years later, the same midwife was called to a monastery outside Vienna to treat a sick child and recognized him immediately. The monks, she learned, had been paid to raise him as an orphan, never knowing his true identity. They called him Felix, meaning happy, because despite his limitations, he radiated joy. He lived among them for 12 years, helping with simple tasks, beloved by the brothers, who saw in his innocence a kind of holiness. When he died of scarlet fever in 880 AD, the entire monastery mourned. The abbot, noting his death in the monastery records, wrote, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could." These hidden children existed in every European royal house, their stories following depressingly similar patterns: birth, recognition of difference, concealment, erasure. Yet occasionally cracks in the official narrative reveal unexpected tenderness. Prussia's Prince Waldemar, born in 1889 to Wilhelm II's sister, was hidden away like all the others. But his nurse, Emma Moeller, used her wages to commission a local artist to paint his portrait every year on his birthday. 17 portraits in total, showing a boy growing into a man, his distinctive features rendered with dignity and care. After his death in 1906 AD, Emma tried to give these portraits to his mother. They were refused, burned in front of her. The last evidence of Waldemar's existence turned to ash. Emma spent her remaining years writing letters to newspapers, trying to tell Waldemar's story, but no paper would publish them. Those letters, found in her belongings after her death, paint a picture of a young man who loved trains, who could identify every bird by its song, who memorized entire orchestral pieces after hearing them once. He was not less than, she wrote repeatedly. He was different than. And different, in God's eyes, is not wrong. In Italy, the House of Savoy dealt with their own secret when Princess Giovanna was born in 1879. Unlike other royal families who hid their children completely, the Savoys attempted a middle ground. Giovanna appeared at certain highly controlled public events, always at a distance, always briefly. The public was told she was delicate and couldn't endure long ceremonies. In reality, she was carefully coached for weeks before each appearance, taught to wave, to smile, to stand still for precisely counted seconds before being whisked away. Behind palace walls, Giovanna lived a more complete life than many of her peers with similar conditions. She had tutors who focused on her strengths, her extraordinary memory for music, her ability to learn through repetition, her gift for understanding animals. She had a small household of servants who spoke to her as a person, not a problem. When she died at age 33, her funeral was private but dignified. King Umberto I, her uncle, reportedly said, "She lived as God made her, and that was enough." But Italy's relative progressiveness was the exception. In Belgium, King Leopold II, infamous for his brutal exploitation of the Congo, showed no more mercy to his own disabled daughter. Born in 1864, a Princess Stephanie's memoirs, published after her father's death, mention a sister who was not spoken of, whose room in the palace was eventually walled off entirely. Servants who worked in the palace during that period, interviewed by historians in the 1920s, described hearing a child's voice from behind those walls for years, singing nonsense songs, calling for a mother who never came. One servant, Marie Delacroix, risked her position to slip food and small toys through a gap in the walled-off section. She testified that the child, she never learned her name, would push drawings back through the same gap, crude, colorful images of people with enormous smiles, of sons with faces, of what might have been attempts at writing Mama. Marie kept one drawing, which she showed to the interviewing historian, a piece of paper covered in handprints made with what appeared to be berry juice, each print surrounded by carefully drawn hearts. Romania's royal family, established only in 1866, quickly learned the rules of royal shame. When Crown Prince Carol's son was born in 1893, with obvious disabilities, the infant was declared dead within hours. But Queen Elizabeth, a poet and mystic who wrote under the name Carmen Silva, couldn't accept this erasure. She wrote extensively in her private journals about the angel child who had been recalled to heaven, too pure for earth. These journals, clearly coded, speak of visiting his star every night, likely a reference to wherever the child was actually kept. A Romanian Orthodox monastery's records from this period show a mysterious patron donating substantial sums for the care of a special child of God. The donations came with specific instructions. The child was to be taught music, given art supplies, never struck or restrained, spoken to with kindness. The donations continued for 7 years and stopped abruptly. The monastery's chronicle notes that their special charge died that same year of a fever that took him gently as he had lived. Even in the 20th century, as medical understanding of Down syndrome improved, royal families continued their patterns of concealment. Greece's royal family, exiled and restored multiple times, left scattered records of children who existed in margins. A physician who treated the Greek royals in exile during the 1920s wrote in his memoirs about examining a teenage princess whose existence was completely unofficial. She had been born with Down syndrome and hidden from birth. Her parents told she had died, but a loyal servant had spirited her away, raised her in secret, and only sought medical help when the girl developed pneumonia. The physician treated her successfully, but was shocked by the family's response. Rather than joy at discovering their daughter lived, they offered him a fortune to solve the problem permanently. He refused, fled the country, and spent decades wondering what became of that girl who had clutched his hand and called him nice man over and over, the only words she knew. In the Netherlands, whispers persisted for generations about Queen Wilhelmina's lost child. Official records show only one daughter, Juliana, but household staff from the 1890s told different stories. They spoke of a second pregnancy, a birth that resulted in no announcement, a child who lived briefly in the palace before vanishing. Years later, a Dutch farmer's family in Friesland would tell stories of their touched daughter, who had been left with them as an infant by mysterious benefactors who paid for her care but never visited. This girl, who lived until 1934 a day, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Dutch royal family, but no one dared voice such observations aloud. Norway's monarchy, independent only since 1905 AD, faced their test in 1912 when Princess Ragnhild was born to the future King Olav V. The princess lived officially for 3 days. Unofficially, she lived for 8 years in a special medical facility in Switzerland, visited monthly by a Norwegian noblewoman whose face was always veiled. The facility's records, seized by the Nazis in 1940 and later recovered by the Allies, document a child with mongoloid features who showed affection to all and found joy in simple pleasures. Her death in 1920 is attributed to the influenza pandemic, though she likely died from heart complications common to her condition. These stories span centuries and dynasties, but patterns emerge with depressing consistency: shame, fear, concealment, erasure, royal blood that wasn't royal enough, divine right undermined by human variation. The very qualities that make Down syndrome individuals often extraordinarily loving, joyful, and free from the pretensions that torment typical people. These qualities were antithetical to royal power structures built on hierarchy, competition, and carefully controlled bloodlines. Yet between the lines of official denials and destroyed records, we find glimpses of humanity. Servants who risked everything to show kindness, nurses who kept photographs and drawings, monks and nuns who saw holiness where others saw only shame. Even some royal parents who, despite the pressures of their position, found ways to ensure their hidden children received some measure of care and comfort. Consider Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in 1915 AD to Crown Prince Wilhelm. Unlike earlier generations, her parents didn't claim she had died. Instead, they placed her in a specialized institution where she received education tailored to her abilities. She learned to read simple texts, to write her name, to play piano badly, but with enthusiasm. When the Nazis came to power and began their euthanasia programs targeting disabled individuals, her family faced an impossible choice. Records suggest she was quietly moved to Switzerland, where she lived under an assumed name until her death in 1980 AD. Having outlived the empire she was born to inherit. World War II marked a turning point, though not always for the better. The Nazis' systematic murder of disabled individuals, including those with Down syndrome, shocked even royal families who had hidden such children for centuries. Some recognized their own complicity in creating the attitudes that made such genocide possible. Others simply became more careful about concealment, understanding that in a world where such children could be murdered by the state, private shame was preferable to public knowledge. After the war, as Europe rebuilt and modernized, royal attitudes began slowly shifting. When Prince Zhang of Luxembourg was born in 1957 AD with Down syndrome, his family made a revolutionary decision. They acknowledged him. Not fully, not proudly, but they admitted he existed, that he lived in a special care facility, that he was their son and brother. It was a crack in centuries of absolute denial. By the 1960s and 1970s, medical advances meant children with Down syndrome were living longer, healthier lives. Royal families could no longer claim such children inevitably died in infancy. Some began quietly supporting organizations that helped families with disabled children, though rarely acknowledging why they had such interest. Others continued old patterns, but with modern efficiency. Private institutions in discreet locations, trust funds that ensured silence, medical records that vanished into private archives. Spain's modern royal family broke entirely with tradition when, in 1973 AD, they publicly acknowledged that King Juan Carlos's nephew had been born with Down syndrome. The child appeared in family photographs, attended certain public events, was spoken of with affection rather than shame. It was revolutionary, yet it highlighted how recently such basic human recognition had been denied to these children. Today we know that Down syndrome is simply a genetic variation, occurring in roughly 1 in every 700 births across all populations, all social classes, all bloodlines. We know that individuals with Down syndrome can live full, meaningful lives, that they experience the same range of emotions as anyone else, that their intellectual disabilities don't diminish their humanity. We know this now. But for centuries, royal families who claimed divine appointment, who justified their power through supposed genetic superiority, couldn't afford to know this. Modern royal families still face these challenges, though typically with more compassion than their predecessors. When rumors surface about a royal child with disabilities, palace public relations teams issue careful statements about privacy and family matters. Support is provided, care is arranged, but full integration into royal life remains rare. Old habits die hard, and the pressure for royal children to be perfect, or at least appear perfect, persists. Some historians argue that these hidden children represent one of monarchy's greatest moral failures, the systematic denial of humanity to their most vulnerable members. Others point out that royal families were products of their time, following medical and social conventions that labeled such children as mongoloid idiots and recommended institutionalization. Both perspectives hold truth. Royal families didn't create society's prejudices against disability, but their positions of power meant they bear special responsibility for perpetuating them. In researching these stories, one finds an archive of absence. Destroyed records, scratched out names, portraits painted over, graves unmarked or moved. For every documented case, how many others left no trace at all? How many royal children with Down syndrome lived their entire lives known only to a handful of servants sworn to secrecy? How many died believing themselves orphans, never knowing that somewhere in a palace, their parents continued producing heirs who better fit their royal mold? Yet perhaps the most tragic element isn't the secrecy itself, but what that secrecy cost everyone involved. Parents who might have loved their different children instead learned to see them as shameful secrets. Siblings who might have developed empathy and understanding instead grew up believing in their own genetic superiority. And the hidden children themselves, who might have thrived with proper support and acceptance, instead lived diminished lives in the shadows. Modern medicine has given us tools these historical figures lacked. Prenatal testing can now detect Down syndrome before birth, leading to different but equally complex moral choices. Some royal families have likely terminated pregnancies upon receiving such diagnoses, adding another layer to this history of absence. Others have chosen to continue pregnancies and raise children with disabilities, though rarely in the public eye. The last confirmed case of a European royal child with Down syndrome being completely hidden from public knowledge occurred in the 1960s, though rumors persist of more recent cases handled with extreme discretion. Privacy laws and modern medical ethics make it harder to track such stories, which is perhaps as it should be. These children deserve privacy, but not erasure. They deserve protection, but not imprisonment. What would history look like if these children had been acknowledged? If Prince John had stood beside his brother Edward VIII during the abdication crisis? If the Spanish Habsburgs had recognized that their pure bloodline produced as much variation as any peasant family? If just one royal family, somewhere in those centuries of denial, had said, "This is our child, different but beloved, and we will not hide them." We cannot rewrite history, cannot restore names to scratched out records, or mark graves that have been lost. But we can recognize that these forgotten princes and princesses existed, that they mattered, that their lives had value beyond their inability to inherit thrones or secure alliances. They were children who laughed and cried, who felt love and loneliness, who experienced the world in ways their normal siblings never could. Some found moments of joy despite their circumstances. The unnamed Russian Grand Duchess arranging her glass pieces, Prince Gustav predicting weather, Felix bringing happiness to his monastery. Others likely lived lives of profound isolation and neglect, understanding only that they were somehow wrong, somehow shameful, somehow less than human in the eyes of those who should have protected them. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats difference, how power structures reinforce narrow definitions of worth, how shame gets passed down through generations like a twisted inheritance. Royal families in their treatment of disabled children held up a mirror to society's darkest impulses, the desire to eliminate difference, to hide imperfection, to pretend that human variation is abnormality rather than nature's rule. Today's royal families navigate a different world, one where disability rights movements have changed public consciousness, where inclusion is valued, at least in principle, if not always in practice. But the ghosts of those hidden children remain, haunting palace corridors and unmarked graves, reminding us that privilege and power don't automatically confer compassion, that blue blood can run just as cold as any other. Picture again that child in the Habsburg Tower, watching dust motes dance in morning light. Their name might have been Ferdinand, or Franz, or Maria, or any of dozens of names we'll never know. They lived and died in a shame that wasn't theirs to bear, victims of a worldview that couldn't accommodate difference, couldn't see beauty in variation, couldn't recognize that the true deficit lay not in their extra chromosome, but in their family's missing compassion. Their attendant leaves, footsteps fading down stone corridors. The child returns to watching light and shadow play across ancient walls, unaware that hundreds of others across Europe share their fate. Royal blood that wasn't royal enough, divine appointment undermined by human reality. They hum a tune no one else will ever hear, arrange objects in patterns that make sense only to them, and wait for tomorrow's bowl of cold porridge, tomorrow's silent attendant, tomorrow's few moments of filtered sunlight in a room the world pretends doesn't exist. In the end, these forgotten royals tell us less about Down syndrome than about power itself, how it corrupts not just through ambition, but through fear, not just through cruelty, but through shame. They remind us that every society creates its shadows, its unmentionables, its disappeared. The measure of civilization isn't in its palaces or crown jewels, but in how it treats those who don't fit the mold, who can't play the game, who exist outside the boundaries of acceptable difference. Somewhere in Europe, in unmarked graves and forgotten corners of royal crypts, lie the bones of princes and princesses whose only crime was being born different. Their names erased, their faces destroyed, their existence denied. Yet they lived, they breathed and laughed and cried and died, fully human despite every effort to pretend otherwise. And in their silence they speak volumes about what happens when bloodline matters more than blood, when appearance trumps reality, when the fear of imperfection becomes more monstrous than any imagined defect. You are still in that tower room, centuries collapsed into a single moment of abandonment. But now you know you're not alone. Across time and space, in palaces and convents and institutions, others share your fate. History will forget your name, but you existed, you mattered. And in that dawnlight filtering through stone and centuries, that's enough. It has to be enough. Because it's all that remains when power chooses shame over love, absence over presence, forgetting over the harder work of remembering.